Hey there. Welcome to another episode of The Cutting Room Floor. This is a segment where I take you a little more in depth into something that we've looked at here in a recent message at Sunny Slope Church. I'll take you to something that's maybe a little too detailed or a little more technical than we'd otherwise have room for in a message, or maybe it's a little rabbit trail that we get to go down and just dig a little more into the text. Today, I want to show you the garments that the high priest would wear when the high priest would minister at the tabernacle or at the temple. This past Sunday, we looked at the role of the priests in the life of the Israelite community. And today, I thought it might be fun to put up a picture and show you exactly what it is that the priests would wear, and then talk a little bit about the significance of each of their pieces of clothing, because as you might imagine, most of the clothing that they wore had some kind of meaning or some kind of significance. So I'm going to share my screen here with you so that you can see. So this is the priest, and you can kind of see it. It's obviously there's no telling exactly what the priest uniform would have looked like, but this is a pretty good representation of the clothing that the priest would have worn when he ministered at the tabernacle or at the temple. I'm gonna start at the top, and we'll start with the crown. The turban was really a head covering. In part, you did that as a way of acknowledging that you were in the presence of royalty, in the presence of the king. But there's also this piece here, which would have been the sort of the crown that the priest wore. The turban itself, this part here on top, was probably made up of a woven or a piece of linen that would have just simply been wound around the head. And then as part of that head covering, this gold piece here would have had inscribed on it the words "Holy to the Lord." I run out of room, but you get the sense. That would have been on the head covering. That is one of the things that I mentioned on Sunday, because that designation was a constant reminder that the priests had been a people set apart and designated for service to God. They were, in that sense, they were not ordinary people. They had a specific role. They had been consecrated and ordained and chosen by God for service in the temple. And so they played a unique role. They were unlike anyone else in Israel. All right, we're going to go down just a little bit. And I want to look at we'll zoom back out here. And I want to look at now it's a little hard to see because in this case it's covered up, but the pants that the priest would have worn. And you can kind of see they're underneath here. And they were obviously there where pants are. That's not rocket science, I don't think, but the significance of them is that the priests, when the priests would minister in those days, I mean, clothing was obviously very different. The priests many people don't necessarily have anything on underneath their clothing, or at least under their robes, but the priests had to ensure that their nakedness before God was covered. Now, this gets a little bit PG-13, I guess, but if a priest were walking up an altar, for example, and had nothing on underneath his cloak, then it would be possible for his nakedness to be exposed. By the way, this is also one of the reasons that it is thought that altars in those days did not have steps, but they would have a ramp that you could go up to walk up, but not steps, because steps would increase the possibility that as you're moving and walking up steps, it would increase the possibility that the priest's nakedness could be seen and would be exposed, and that would not have been acceptable. It was important that the priests do everything to cover their nakedness before God. over top of the pants is then the tunic, and I'll show you that here in a second. The tunic is sort of the whole robe covering that the priest wore. Now, this did not necessarily play any spiritual or significant role, but it simply served to be the sort of the main covering over the priest. The tunic was, yeah, it was like their sort of their overcoat, you might say. It was, you can see here, it was woven in a checkered pattern, and the sleeves were separate and then sewn onto the tunic. The priest would wear a belt around the outside. That's not, I don't think, anything all that earth-shattering. That probably didn't have any major significance, at least spiritually speaking. Perhaps it most likely just served to keep the tunic on and then the robe on. The robe is that outer portion as well. What I want to show you about the robe, I can get my mouse. At the bottom of the robe, right down here, there are two things that would have been woven onto the bottom of the robe. The first is represented here by these purple spherical things. Those were in the shape of pomegranates, and those were meant to take you back really to the Garden of Eden, and they matched with the decorative embroidery in the tabernacle itself, and so they kind of made a connection between the priest and the tabernacle. The other thing that would have been on the hem of the tabernacle are these little golden, they were actually just bells. There's sort of two reasons for the bells. One of them is a little more functional, and one of them is a little more symbolic. The symbolic meaning is that bells would announce the approach of someone of importance, and so the bells, in some ways, in some ancient Near East settings, if you were entering into the presence of the king, you would be wearing bells as a way of alerting the king that someone was coming. And so because the tabernacle was a sort of royal throne room, then the priest is wearing bells as a way to symbolically announce that he is approaching. However, there's a separate reason for the bells, and that has to do with it's more of a functional thing. And that is actually for the priest's own safety and for the priest's own protection, because the priest is serving in the presence of God. It was important that if anything were to go wrong, then people would know about it. So if the priest were to go into the most holy place and do something, perform his duties in a way that he should not have done, that could be life-threatening to the priest. In fact, it could kill him, as we see in Leviticus chapter 10. And so the priest would be struck down dead. The way that the people would know that something had gone wrong is that they would no longer hear the bells ringing. The bells would stop, and that would be likely an indicator that something had gone wrong, and they needed to then remove the priest from within the most holy place. One of the things that is perhaps most unfamiliar to us is what was called the ephod. I'm going to show you. The ephod is this here, and you can see that it's attached to the robe. So you have the robe. The robe is this outer garment here. And then over the robe, the priest would wear this. It sort of is for lack of better term, it's sort of an apron, but it doesn't hang all the way down. It just would cover about this. It's a square piece. And each of these things here, you can see there's 3 rows or 3 columns of 4, and in here they're just represented by circles. each of those circles, there's 12 of them, and each one of them had inscribed on it the name of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so that would be a way, then I mentioned this in the message, that the priest is bearing God's people close to his heart. He's carrying his people close to his heart as he represents them before God. Up here, you can see those that would have been on those two things here would have been on the robe itself that was worn. And these are also precious stones. And each stone had 6 names written onto it. And that was there's a slightly different meaning. Each has 6 tribes of Israel. And what the priest is doing is bringing those names, bearing those names on his shoulders before the presence of God. And so it's sort of a way of representing the people before God. But in this case here, it's more a concern. It's more a message that he's interceding for the people, and he's praying for each of them as he bears them close to his heart. So that's the picture of the priest. And again, just to kind of zoom out here, this gives you a sense of what the priests would have looked like, how they would have conducted themselves. By the way, the high priest wore a slightly different costume than the regular priest. There's one more thing. It's not really mentioned in the in Leviticus, but it's maybe just worth a comment or two. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that I think this part here, this little thing tucked into the side, is supposed to represent what was called the Urim and the Thummim. Nobody knows exactly what that was, but it's something that the high priest would carry with him tucked into his breastplate. And it was meant to discern the judgment of God. Now, again, nobody's exactly clear on how that functioned or how it was used or even what exactly it was, but it did serve that function and that purpose of discerning the Lord's will and the Lord's guidance. And there are a number of occasions recorded in Scripture where the priest would use that Urim and the Thummim as a way of determining what God's will was, because that was in part what the priest was responsible to do. That's it for the priest. And I think, anytime you talk about the role and the work of a priest, we always remember that the fullness of the gospel lets us know that we have a greater priest who has come, right? Jesus is the one who is our representative before God. He's the one who has made the payment for our sin, who represents us personally before the throne of God, so that we always have an intercessor. We always have one who is pleading our case and carrying our names close to his heart before the presence of God. As always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on the cutting room floor.